April 19th, 1945. A muddy transit camp near Koblenz, Germany. 34 German women sat on splintered wooden benches, their gray-blue auxiliary uniforms stained with the filth of 3 days on foot. They had surrendered 6 days earlier to American infantry outside Cologne, expecting bullets. Instead, they received water from canteens that smelled of tobacco and machine oil. Now, as the spring evening settled cold around them, an American soldier approached with metal trays. On each tray sat 2 golden cobs of corn, charred black in spots, dripping with melted butter. Women stared. One of them, a 23-year-old signals auxiliary named Anneliese Brenne, whispered to the woman beside her, "They're feeding us pig food." The others nodded. This was corn, tear fodder, animal feed. What you gave to livestock when you had nothing better. And now the Americans were serving it to them as a meal. They refused to touch it. They pushed the trays away. Some looked like they might cry. But within 1 hour, something impossible happened. These same women were laughing, licking butter from their fingers, asking for more. What changed their minds so quickly? And why did a simple cob of corn shatter everything they believed about their enemy? Before we go further, if you love untold stories from history, hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We love hearing from our community across the globe. And if this story moves you, share it with someone who appreciates real history. Now, let's go back to April 1945, when 34 German women discovered that everything they had been taught was a lie. It all started with a cob of corn, and in that moment of hesitation with butter congealing on cold kernels, these women began to realize that their enemy was not what they had been told. The propaganda had cracked. The truth was dripping onto their trays. The spring of 1945 arrived in Germany not with birdsong, but with the grinding roar of Sherman tanks and the distant percussion of artillery that shook the ground for miles. By March, the Western Allies had crossed the Rhine. By April, the Third Reich was hemorrhaging territory, faster than its commanders could redraw their maps. Caught in the current of this collapse were not only soldiers, but women uniformed members of the German war machine, Luftwaffe communications auxiliaries, Wehrmacht telephone operators, anti-aircraft battery helpers, military nurses and administrative clerks, women who had signed up or been conscripted to free men for the front lines, women who believed they would never see the enemy face to face. By April 1945, an estimated 500,000 German women were serving in military auxiliary roles across the Reich. Of these, approximately 12,000 to 15,000 would be captured by American forces in the war's final weeks. Anneliese Brenne was one of them. 23 years old, a signals auxiliary stationed near Cologne, she had spent the war routing communications through a switchboard in a concrete bunker that smelled of copper wiring and stale cigarette smoke. She had never fired a weapon. She had never seen a dead body until the bombing raids began. On April 7th, her unit received orders to retreat eastward. By April 9th, those orders were meaningless. American infantry had encircled their position. Anneliese and 33 other women surrendered in a muddy farmyard, their hands raised, their uniforms splattered with the filth of roads they had walked for 3 days straight. "I thought they would shoot us," she would later recall in a 1987 interview with the German Oral History Project, Stimmen der Generation. That is what we had been told, that the Americans were barbarians, that they would not spare women. They were not shot. Instead, a young American sergeant with a drawling accent she could not place, Staff Sergeant Virgil Thibodeau, Cajun from Lafayette, Louisiana, gestured for them to sit beside a hedgerow while his men secured the farmhouse. He offered them water from his own canteen. Annalise noticed his hands were steady, his voice calm. There was no malice in his eyes. The paradox struck her immediately. This was the enemy. This soft-spoken man who smelled of tobacco and machine oil, who handed out canteens as if they were guests rather than prisoners. Elsewhere across the collapsing front, similar scenes unfolded. Waltraud Pfeiffer Traudel, to her friends, was captured near Aachen, a sharp-tongued telephone operator from Berlin. She had spent the final weeks of the war convinced that surrender meant execution. When American soldiers instead handed her a blanket and a tin cup of coffee, she wept. She could not understand it. Alfred Latman, 19 years old, an anti-aircraft helper who had spent months cranking rangefinders while bombers droned overhead, was captured outside Frankfurt. She weighed barely 90 pounds. She had not eaten a full meal in 11 days. When the Americans loaded her onto a truck bound for a transit camp, she was too weak to climb the tailgate. A black American soldier, technician 5th grade, Woodrow Pettigrew, lifted her up as gently as if she were his own sister. I did not know what to feel. Alfred later wrote in a letter to her niece decades after the war. Gratitude? Shame? I had been taught to hate these people, and here one was carrying me. The women were transported to temporary processing camps, former Wehrmacht barracks, requisition schools, fenced compounds in liberated towns. The camps were crowded, chaotic, and smelled of rain-soaked canvas and disinfectant. But they were not death camps. They were not starvation camps. They were holding facilities run by an army that had supply lines stretching back across the Atlantic Ocean, and those supply lines carried things the German women had not seen in years: coffee, sugar, flour, powdered eggs, tinned meat, and corn, bright golden American corn. The women did not know it yet, but what awaited them at the American field kitchens would challenge everything they had been taught about their captors and about themselves. The abundance itself would become a weapon, not of bullets or bombs, but of butter and bread, and it would begin to dismantle the lies they had been told, one meal at a time. The German women had no idea what fed them. They saw only the end result: hot meals served 3 times a day, fresh bread, real coffee, not the bitter acorn substitutes they had choked down for years. Meat that was not horse meat or mystery rations, stamped with codes they could not read. But behind every meal was a machine so vast, so powerful, that it reshaped modern warfare itself. The United States military supply system in 1945 was the largest logistical operation in human history. Every day, American forces in Europe consumed 800,000 tons of supplies: food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, clothing, all of it shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded at ports in France and Belgium, then trucked or trained hundreds of miles to the front lines. By April 1945, the U.S. Army operated more than 240,000 trucks in Europe alone. The famous Red Ball Express, a convoy system that ran day and night, moved 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours at its peak, and prisoners of war were fed from the same kitchens as American soldiers. This was not kindness, it was doctrine. The Geneva Convention required it. But more than that, General Dwight Eisenhower understood something his enemies did not. Well-fed prisoners did not riot. They did not attempt mass escapes. They did not spread typhus or dysentery through overcrowded camps. Feeding prisoners was strategic, it was efficient, and it sent a message. Corporal Emmett Lindquist, a Swedish-American supply clerk from Minnesota, wrote home to his wife in late April 1945. His letter, preserved in the Minnesota Historical Society archives, described the scene at a transit camp near Koblenz. We unloaded 6 truckloads of rations today: canned beef, powdered milk, flour, coffee, sugar, and 200 crates of Iowa corn. The German prisoners stared like we had delivered gold bars. One of their officers asked me if this was food for the guards. I told him, no, it's for everyone. He did not believe me. The field kitchens operated like assembly lines. Private First Class Lester Szymanski, a Nebraska farm boy assigned to the 3rd Armored Division's mess unit, worked 14-hour shifts. He and his crew could feed 1,200 men in under 2 hours. Breakfast was powdered eggs, toast, coffee, and canned fruit. Lunch was stew or hash. Dinner was meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread. And the German POWs received the same rations, not smaller portions, not leftovers, the same food, cooked in the same pots, served on the same tin trays. For women like Renata Stahlberg, a military nurse who had spent the final year of the war treating wounded soldiers in hospitals with no morphine, no bandages, and no heat, the abundance was impossible to process. She had watched men die from infected wounds because there was no penicillin. She had boiled and reused surgical thread until it frayed. She had scrubbed bloodstains from her only uniform in freezing water because there were no replacements. And now, sitting on a bench in an American POW camp, she was handed a metal tray with beef stew, white bread, canned peaches, and coffee with real sugar. She stared at it. I thought it was a trick, she admitted in a 1979 interview with a German documentary crew. I thought they were showing us this food to humiliate us before taking it away, but they did not take it away. Staff Sergeant Virgil Thibodeau walked the line of seated German women, a ladle in one hand, a cigarette tucked behind his ear. He ladled stew into bowls without comment, his movements practiced and calm. He had done this 1,000 times. To him it was routine. To the women it was a shock. Hannelore Fichtner, a communications auxiliary in her early 30s, leaned toward Renata and whispered, "Do their soldiers eat like this every day?" Renata did not answer. She did not know. But the evidence was everywhere. The American soldiers were tall. Their uniforms fit properly. Their faces were not hollow. Their hands did not shake from hunger. The contrast was undeniable, and it was humiliating. These were the same soldiers German propaganda had mocked as soft, as weak as a mongrel nation incapable of discipline or sacrifice. Yet here they stood, well-fed and well-supplied, while the so-called master race sat in muddy camps, starving and defeated. The abundance itself became a weapon, not bullets or bombs, but butter and bread. The sheer scale of American production overwhelmed the senses. It dismantled certainty. It raised questions the women had been forbidden to ask. If America could feed its prisoners this well, what did that say about Germany's claims of superiority? If the enemy was this strong, this organized, this humane, What did that say about the war itself? Ottilie Drexler, an administrative clerk who had once filed reports in a spotless Wehrmacht office in Munich, sat with her tray untouched. She had believed in the Reich. She had believed in the Führer's promises. She had believed Germany would win. Now she believed nothing. The food sat before her, steamy in the cool April air, and she understood for the first time that everything she had been told was a lie. What came next would make that realization even sharper. The next evening, the women lined up for dinner as they had the night before. The routine had become familiar. Stand in line, take a tray, move past a serving station, sit on the long wooden benches, eat in silence while American soldiers watched from a respectful distance. But tonight, something was different. As Annalise reached the front of the line, she froze. On the serving table, piled high on metal trays, were dozens of bright yellow corn cobs. Each one was grilled, charred black in spots, glistening with melted butter. Steam rose from them in the cool evening air. The smell was sweet, smoky, rich, and Annalise had no idea what she was looking at. Behind her, Waltraud leaned forward to see what had caused the delay. When she saw the corn, her face twisted in confusion. "Was ist das?" she muttered. "What is that?" Private Delbert Martinelli, a cheerful Italian-American from Brooklyn, grinned and held up a cob. "Corn, fresh off the grill. You're gonna love it." He dropped 2 cobs onto Annalise's tray with a pair of tongs. She stared down at them, bewildered. Waltraud took her tray and moved down the line. When she sat down, she leaned toward Renata and whispered urgently, "They are feeding us Tierfutter animal feed." The word spread through the group like wildfire. Tierfutter, Schweinfutter, Viehfutter, pig food, livestock feed. Elfried looked at the corn on her tray and felt her stomach turn. She had grown up on a farm outside Dresden. She knew exactly what corn was. Her family had grown it every summer, not to eat, but to chop into silage and feed to the pigs and cattle. Corn was not human food. It was coarse. It was cheap. It was what you gave to animals when you had nothing better. And now the Americans were serving it to them as a meal. Hannelore held her cob by the very tip, as if it might contaminate her fingers. She turned it slowly, inspecting the kernels, the char marks, the melted fat dripping onto her tray. "Why are they doing this?" she whispered. "Are they mocking us?" Ottilie shook her head slowly. Her voice was bitter. "They think we are animals. That is why." The cultural divide was absolute. In Germany, corn had been grown for centuries, but never as a food crop for people. It was called maize, and it was animal fodder. German farmers planted it, chopped it green, packed it into silos, and fed it to livestock through the winter. No respectable German family would sit down to eat corn. It was unthinkable. But in the United States, corn was a staple. By 1945, American farmers produced over 3 billion bushels of corn annually. Sweet corn, the kind meant for human consumption, was grilled at summer picnics, boiled at family dinners, served at state fairs and church socials. It was as American as apple pie. To a boy from Iowa or Nebraska, grilled corn was childhood. It was summer evenings and backyard barbecues. It was normal. To a woman from Berlin or Munich, it was livestock feed. Private Lester Szymanski noticed the women were not eating. They sat in rows on the benches, trays in front of them, corn untouched. He walked over to Staff Sergeant Thibodeau. "Sarge, they're not eating the corn." Thibodeau glanced over. He saw 34 women staring at their trays like they had been served poison. He chuckled. They don't know what it is. Should I explain? Won't help. Show them. Lester grabbed a cob from the grill, walked to the nearest table, and stood in front of the women. He made eye contact with Annalise, smiled broadly, and took an enormous bite. He chewed slowly, theatrically. Butter ran down his chin. He grinned. See? It's good. The women did not move. Annalise looked at Waltraud. Waltraud looked at Renata. Renata looked at Hannelore. No one wanted to be first. Mechthild Weidman, a former barracks supervisor in her late 30s, folded her arms across her chest. I will not eat pig food. Alfred, the youngest, stared at her cob. She was hungry. She had been hungry for months. But the idea of eating animal feed, of lowering herself too, that made her throat tighten. The corn sat on the trays, cooling in the evening air. The butter began to congeal. The char marks no longer steamed. And still no one took a bite. The American soldiers exchanged glances. Thibodeau shrugged. Leave them be. They'll eat when they're hungry enough. But hunger alone would not be enough to cross this divide. What it would take was something simpler, something human. Curiosity. And in that silence, with the smell of grilled corn hanging in the air, a single question began to form in Annalise's mind. If these men eat this food, if they are strong and healthy and winning the war, ... what if we are wrong? The evening air grew cool as German women sat in a muddy American POW camp, staring at untouched corn on metal trays. Months of hunger had taught them to distrust abundance, and corn animal feed in their world felt like an insult. Whispered objections spread until one woman, Annalise, listened to her growling stomach and lifted a cob. She hesitated, weighed shame against survival, then bit down. The sweetness shocked her. Butter, smoke, warmth, real food. She ate again and again. Watching her, others followed, disbelief melting into relief as trays emptied in silence. Across the compound, American soldiers ate the same food, laughing easily, unconcerned with appearances. That sameness cracked years of propaganda. These men were not monsters or primitives. They were fed, human, and generous. Corn became the turning point. Meals softened tension. Smiles replaced stares. Music drifted through evenings. Work was shared. Hunger faded. When the war ended, the women carried more than rations home. They carried doubt about speeches, newsreels, and everything they had been taught. In ruined Germany, they told families about hot meals, kindness, and yellow corn grilled over fire. Many did not believe them at first, but aid arrived. Corn appeared again. Slowly minds changed. Decades later, the women remembered that first bite as the moment truth entered their lives, not through politics or punishment, but through food. History often turns on battles and treaties, yet sometimes it turns on something smaller, a shared meal offered without hatred. For women, peace began with hunger, sweetness, and corn.